Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Lunch and Learn event entitled Avoiding the News Desert, Addressing Challenges Around Community Media in English-Speaking Quebec. I am Shannon Bell, Research Associate at the Quebec English-Speaking Communities Research Network at Concordia University and author of the brief on which today's presentation is based. I will be presenting the brief as well as moderating the event. The presentation will be in English, with subtitles translated into French if you choose to have them. Pour les sous-titres en français, veuillez choisir le bouton sous-titres en bas à droite de votre écran. Cliquez sur Afficher les sous-titres et cliquez sur l'onglet Traduction. A few technical reminders. Please remember to keep your microphones muted during the event. If you have any technical difficulties, you can write a message in the chat and we will address the issue as best we can. We are recording the session today, and it will be shared on our YouTube page. And please write any questions you may have in the Q&A box. So not the chat box, the Q&A box, which you can find by clicking the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Before continuing, I'd like to acknowledge that while we meet today on a virtual platform, Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. Ganyanka-Kaga Nation is recognized as the custodian of these lands and waters. And Jojoge, Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We continue to reflect on the ways in which we can work in collaboration with Indigenous communities to form mutual and ongoing relationships. This event is made possible through the financial support of the Secrétariat aux relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise. QUESCREN also receives funding from Canadian Heritage, the Canadian Institute for Research on Linguistic Minorities, and Concordia University. Please note that this is a space for intellectual exchange, and any views or opinions expressed in this talk do not necessarily represent those of QUESCREN or its funders. And now I would like to invite Mr. William Flock, Assistant Deputy Minister at the Secretariat, to say a few opening remarks. Over to you, Mr. Flock.
Okay, thank you, Shannon. I'll be very brief. It's a pleasure again to be with everybody and to have the opportunity to learn from invested researchers around questions that are important to the situation of English-speaking Quebecers. I think this is a particularly important one in the sense that the access to media clearly is we're in a very disruptive period, and traditional media that we might have known a generation ago clearly are undergoing great change. But it's also the case that across the regions of Quebec, there have been gaps from time immemorial, essentially, where the critical mass of population hasn't necessarily been there. So people are not able to sustain or have access to local media that speaks to them and their issues. So I'm very interested to hear this kind of update on the lay of the land in terms of media access, and also to hear thoughts on where the future may lay. So I'll just stop there just to say that I'm very much looking forward to hearing today's presentation, as are the others on the line. Thank you, Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Flock. The format for today's event will consist of a presentation of the key findings from the research brief, followed by a panel discussion featuring our guests Magna Konieczka, Associate Professor of Journalism at Concordia, and Hugh Maynard, publisher of The Gleaner, an historic Quebec English language newspaper, recently revived through grassroots funding efforts. And then we'll have a Q&A period at the end. Let's get started. I'll just quickly note that if you do have any questions for me about this portion of the presentation, please go ahead and add them to the Q&A box, and we'll address them during the Q&A period after the panel. I'll begin by introducing the brief series itself, which is a collection of 15 briefs on topics that are important to the English-speaking community of Quebec. They touch a wide range of subjects, including early childhood education, regional demolinguistic population changes, and where to find research on English-speaking Quebec, so a broad range of topics. The briefs aim to give an overview of the available research on a topic, and they compile information from scholarly journals and other academic publications, and in some cases, essays or opinion pieces by experts in the field. So, secondary research. They are meant to give evidence-based background and context to this topic on deck. And with that, I will go into the key findings on this brief on community media in English-speaking Quebec. A good place to start is to look at the importance of community media, especially with respect to minority language communities. Homegrown news sharing allows communities to keep up with local businesses, politics, and local events. The loss of such news sources can impact the sense of community connection among residents. In a 2017 report entitled Disruption, Change, and Churning in Canada's Media Landscape, the federal government underlined how local media outlets support the development and vitality of minority language communities and help bring them out of isolation. The report also noted that such publications allow the government to communicate with the public, who are people, in both official languages. The idea of communicating with public governance is one that will come back again in a moment when we touch on news deserts. But overall, there appears to be a consensus amongst the government and academia that community-based news is essential to democracy as well as community vitality. So while the term community media includes print and radio and local TV, the literature for this brief speaks predominantly about print and online publications. The brief does include statistics on radio and TV when available and applicable. But we've been hearing for quite a while that print journalism in particular is at a crossroads. And so the first question that I asked myself when looking into this brief was, how did we get here? So we'll do a flashback to the early 2000s. We began to see decreases in publication frequency and the move toward the digital models in the early 2000s, but it was really 2008 and the economic recession that was a critical year for the industry and dealt a huge blow to what we knew as the newspaper advertising model. And so a brief refresher for those who either forgot or perhaps hadn't realized the link between the economy and our media landscape. When the economy tanked, businesses slashed their advertising budget and newspapers rely heavily on ad revenue, so they took a hit. People were watching their wallets more as well, and so canceling subscriptions and buying fewer newspapers. And then you have the rise of digital media. So free online news and social media drew advertisers and readers away from print. And then you also had classified ads, which were once a big staple of newspapers, which also moved online. So the crisis was really this perfect storm for newspapers, which resulted in the numbers that you see here on this graph. So between 2008 and 2020, total revenue for Canadian community newspapers fell by 60%, mostly among dailies. Advertising revenue dropped considerably, and at least a third of Canadian journalism jobs disappeared. Now, before talking about the changes in the local news services in Quebec specifically, I want to mention another major contributing factor to decline in the industry, which is the consolidation of media ownership, which was this trend that predates the 2008 financial crisis and one that we've seen play out here in Quebec. For years, we've seen newspapers being bought up by large media conglomerates and seeking to streamline operations and cut costs. And the research points out that this consolidation led to fewer independent voices in the media landscape and also led to cuts in newsroom staff, resources, and investigative reporting. While researching this project, I discovered an excellent tool that brings to life the closures and changes in service in local news media outlets across the country, and that is what I used to source the graph that you see here. The Local News Research Project, which is a collaborative initiative that combines content analysis and digital mapping, is crowdsourced. So the data gleaned for this brief was pulled in August 2023 and consequently does not reflect the major Metro Media closures of last fall or any others that may have happened since last summer. And in fact, what came up during my search this time reflected closures and changes that had been reported to the service as of 2022. What the results from this project show is that between 2008 and 2021, nearly 450 news outlets, including TV, radio, and newspapers, closed in more than 300 communities across Canada. The local news map data tool is quite useful for tracking changes in the industry, and the link is included here on the slide if you'd like to take note of it and have a look on your own. So we're going to try something new for us during these conferences, which is a poll. And I want to point out that this is absolutely unscientific and will not be used outside the context of this conference. But we thought we'd try this tool out and see if we can't engage the Zoom room a bit. So we'll give you a couple of seconds to respond once it pops up there, and then we'll look at the results. So I'd like to know if you can rank the following printed news options based on how often you consult them. So they're divided into three sort of geographic categories here: national, international, provincial, regional, local, community. And mostly for the purposes of seeing if our room reflects the data that's out there on readership trends. So I'll give you guys a few more seconds on that. I think the poll is ended because that's what I'm seeing. So I'm going to go ahead and share. I think you probably have the results there if we cannot see. So it looks like, interestingly, provincial and regional is coming up here, if I'm reading it correctly, followed by national, international, and community local. I don't know if I'm reading this correctly. This is the first time we're doing this, so I apologize if my data synthesis on the fly is not going so great. But basically what some people in the industry are saying is that there may be a sustainability problem for these mid-sized regional papers like the Gazette, the Ottawa Citizen, as people who do not live in these metro areas are moving more toward consulting national and international outlets for the bigger headlines and then also their local news sources. But if I'm reading that poll right, the room does not reflect that hypothesis. So interesting to know. So I thank you for indulging me in this poll. So we'll move on now to news deserts. And what is a news desert? So the changing landscape of dwindling local papers and concentrated coverage of national and international affairs can create what researchers refer to as news deserts, or communities where residents have very limited access to the sort of credible and comprehensive news information that feed democracy at the grassroots level. Such deserts can create blind spots, both geographic, when certain areas lack coverage, and thematic, when news coverage fails to address a diverse agenda, which, according to the literature, can have hazardous effects on democracy. Researchers associate the decline in local news with greater polarization, reduced voter engagement, heightened corruption levels, and the election of more ideologically extreme officials. So this sounds very bad, but I want to be clear that the research consulted for this brief does not classify Quebec specifically as being or having a news desert at this time, but it may or may not be true. The research that I came across had just not labeled it that way, and thusly the research brief is called Avoiding the News Desert. So what I aim to do by using this term is to illustrate a possible long-term consequence of the impact of a gap in local media coverage. So what has been done to address this so far? A number of efforts at the federal and provincial level have aimed to address the issue, and in various ways and with varying levels of success. Bill C-18, or the Online News Act, which most of us are familiar with because it changed our social media and news experience, aimed to address the online revenue challenges that we just referred to by imposing a link tax on Google and Meta, which includes Facebook and Instagram, who hold a combined 80% share of online advertising revenue in Canada, which amounts to an estimated 9.7, so nearly $10 billion a year, redirected from local news outlets, according to the research. So, however, in response, Google and Meta blocked the news content from their platforms, as we've seen. And so the brief discusses further some of the arguments for and against the bill, including the idea that the loss of social media as a key low-cost tool in content distribution is particularly difficult for smaller news outlets. As far as funding programs go, there are a few that have been implemented or expanded upon over the past few years, and I list a few of them here. Quebec, notably, is the only province at the time of this brief's publication to have adopted community media funding programs. There are a few funding initiatives through the federal government as well, like the Local Journalism Initiative, which we'll touch on during the panel discussion. It funds the hiring of journalists in underserved communities and was initially rolled out in a 5-year plan from 2018 to 2023 and was recently renewed through 2027. And the brief outlines the programs a bit more in detail and has hyperlinks for you to click on their page if you'd like to do so. So let's do another poll because that was so much fun before. This time I'd like to know whether you just subscribe, and by subscribe I mean pay. Do you pay for a local news publication? So this one's a bit more simple, a yes or no. I should be able to read the results a bit better this time. They were 33 in the room. 23 have answered. All right, the results are in. 57% of you do not, and 43% of you do, which is actually in line with the statistics, which say that readers are less likely to pay for local online news than they do or did for those same publications when they were in their print format. And as a result, the research shows that community outlets are struggling to drum up sufficient web subscription revenue. And so interestingly enough, this has proven contrary to previous belief, which was that the shift to online would be a one-to-one solution for the decline of print. Instead, though, as we're seeing is the same in this room, is that local newspapers especially have struggled to make up for a loss of print advertising revenue. And that is thanks in large part to Facebook and Google, as we previously noted here. Hence the need for a new plan, which brings me to my next slide. So what we're seeing emerge in recent years are models that do not rely on advertising revenue to such a large extent, and instead involve breaking up the consolidation format. And this entails moving toward crowd-funded and community donation projects that emphasize local ownership. And I'll list a few provincial examples here. I won't go into too much detail, though I do add some more details in the brief about each individual project. But if you're curious about any of these, I encourage you to take note and check them out. But basically the point here is the future is not too terrible looking, and there is hope. And on that note, I will just conclude by saying that it's been clear for some time that the media landscape is changing. And research is ongoing, but preliminary scholarship shows that news deserts are becoming increasingly prevalent. And isolated and minority communities, such as our English-speaking linguistic minority community here in Quebec, are hit the hardest by this. In conclusion of the brief, I suggest funding for research into these new grassroots models to help determine and solidify a path forward. So to dive into some of these possible paths forward, it is now my pleasure to introduce our two guests. I will stop sharing my screen briefly here. Will I stop sharing my screen? So I'll just introduce our two panelists today. We have Magda Konieczna, who is an associate professor of journalism at Concordia University. Prior to moving to Quebec in 2021, she spent her academic career in the US, studying the changing news business. She's the author of Journalism Without Profit, Making News When the Market Fails, published in 2018 through Oxford University Press, which explores the growth of nonprofit news organizations in the United States. She was the City Hall reporter at the now closed Guelph Mercury in Ontario. We also have Hugh Maynard with us, who's a consulting specialist and owner of Quanglo Communications and Consulting, based in Ormstown, Quebec, which is an enterprise focused on communications, strategic and organizational planning, and development initiatives for rural communities. He's freelanced for the CBC over the years and currently acts as the publisher of The Gleaner, a bi-weekly community newspaper serving the Chateauguay Valley region. He has held numerous executive and consulting positions with provincial organizations representing the English-speaking community. So Magda, my first question is for you. You've mentioned how you prefer not to call it community journalism, but community-centered journalism. Can you talk a bit about that and why you find it an important distinction to make?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Shannon. And thanks for your great brief and for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm always a little humbled to be in the presence of people who did actual things like save their local newspaper. I just think about how to do that. So thanks very much. Yeah, there's been sort of a rise in people promoting this idea of community-centered journalism. And I really love that because I think that when we talk about community journalism, it can sometimes be sort of a derogatory term. And, I've worked for those papers where there's the photo of the person getting the giant check on the cover or whatever. And kind of this idea that that's not sort of where the important journalism happens. But I tend to think in my own work that it's the local that really matters. That's where there's the potential to really impact our lives. And from my perspective as a scholar and an instructor, that's where we have the potential to really sort of engage people in what's going on in their local communities. And so this idea of community-centered journalism, where we think about what already exists in the community, how are people in the community already communicating, what do folks in the community say they need and want in order to make their community a better place? I really like thinking about it in that way. And in some ways it's radical and in some ways it's not. I mean, newspapers have always done focus groups, and it was mostly for sort of an advertising to answer advertising related questions. But the idea of sort of bringing folks into the newsroom, understanding what do they need, and thinking of the journalist really as a member of the community who contributes to civic life in the community is sort of what the idea of community-centered journalism means for me.
Okay, thank you for that distinction. I'll now go over to Hugh and ask about your experience reviving The Gleaner. So as I understand it, it was founded in 1863 and experienced some of the effects of the industry fallout that I discussed in the brief. And after some consolidation measures, at one point it became an insert in the local French language paper. Can you tell us the origins of your efforts to revive it and what methods you used to bring it back in the context of the current media landscape?
Yes, okay. So yes, founded in 1863, typical of a community newspaper, especially in rural areas, family owned. And then over time sold out to corporate interests, one media chain after the other. And in the summer of 2018, the latest in a sequence of media chains decided that the paper, after having closed it as a separate publication and made it an insert in the French language giveaway, that it wasn't financially viable. To their credit, they came to the community and said this is a historic publication. It belongs to the English-speaking community. If you want it, here you can have it. That was literally the sort of the message. And so we put a notice in, funnily enough, in Facebook, and held a public meeting in the local church hall. 38 people showed up. 11 people signed up to a steering committee. We put together a package and bought the title of the Gleaner for $1 from the owner, and launched a GoFundMe campaign. And with the $25,000 that we raised in a month, we had enough juice to be able to print a series of monthly gleaners done completely by volunteers. And I always remember at the launch of the first of those in June 2019, 200 people showed up with checks in hand to make donations and buy subscriptions. And also advertisers responded very well. So by Christmas 2019, we had generated about $135,000, $140,000 in revenue. Some expenses, of course, for publishing the paper, and decided to launch on a bi-weekly basis. And of course, that was 2 steps away from COVID and mayhem at every level of operation. I have to say that the what we call the blue ads, the COVID ads from the provincial government, saved our bacon and a lot of other small newspapers, because advertising simply disappeared for virtually 6 months during the initial stages of COVID. So we were very lucky in that regard. So that's what we did. And ever since, we're now approaching our 5th year. We've been modestly in the black, and credit to the programs that you've mentioned in your presentation from the federal and the provincial governments, but also a tremendous level of support and engagement from the community. And the key to that, as far as I'm concerned, is that we formed a non-profit. So it's owned by the community. It's not a private enterprise that's in a corporate office in downtown Toronto. It's owned by the community. There's a board of directors from the community, and we are responsible to the community. And the second part of that is our approach to things is that the Gleaner is not just a newspaper, it's an information service provider. And the subtle difference between that is our mandate is to inform the community. We happen to do it publishing a newspaper because that's what people will pay for with a subscription, and that's a website and an app, that's what they want. But if we put a very healthily voiced teenager on a soapbox in front of the IGA with a script and a bell and to yell out the news as the most effective way to communicate, that's what we would do. Our mandate is to inform. We happen to do it as a newspaper. And I think that's a slightly different approach to many of the commercial publications. I'm not criticizing necessarily, but it's the approach that we've taken to try and maintain viability as well as engagement with the community.
And on the note of that, you'd mentioned also that there were some efforts that another project of yours was to take those resources that you've built with the revival of the Gleaner and sort of make them on offer for other small communities. Right. Through the project. Could you talk a little bit about that?
So the other aspect is that following a model that has been in place for 200 years of simply advertising subscriptions as revenue sources, is we won't stay in business very long. If the current subscription for the Gleaner is $60 for 22 issues. If we were to charge the real value of that subscription to cover the costs, it would be like $250, right? We have to make up the revenue. The other thing is that with the advertising base, we're a small rural minority language community, so we have challenges in that regard. So I need to, as a publisher, generate revenue from other sources in order to ensure the people who put out the paper can be employed. Because otherwise they're all going to be part-timers, and nobody's going to stick around for very long, and we're not going to be able to maintain quality and all the other aspects. So we've looked at other avenues of revenue generation that are complementary, that fit in with our mandate to inform, but also then help us generate the additional revenues we need to have qualified, experienced, quality employees on a full-time basis. And one of those is called Quebec Connect. And if I could just share my screen, you can see it up there. So what we've done is developed a news service using the expertise that's inherent within the Gleaner. And the idea, it will enable us to fill out some of the part-time positions. And this website is targeted not as a competition to existing news publications, but to those regional areas in Quebec where there are English-speaking communities that don't have their own community media and probably never will, because there's just not enough people to sustain a publication. The Lower North Shore, Sept-Îles, Thetford Mines, all those locations where there's a few hundred English speakers, they still need news, they still need information. And so what we've done is we put together a website, we've developed a script using artificial intelligence to literally crawl the web, and we're teaching it to identify news that is of interest to English-speaking communities in rural Quebec, which is quite a challenge, which, as you can see, one of the titles here, I don't know if you can read it, it says business opportunities with Senegal for the production of Senbec in Pointe-aux-Trembles. Well, it's in the regions, but it's not really of interest to the English-speaking community. But then you look at some of the other titles. Quebec is putting $5.8 million into museums and institutions, which I think is of interest to English-speaking communities. So it's supported by the Secretariat, put in some initial investment into the prototype, and we're just finishing up a project with Canadian Heritage. And I invite you, quebec-connect.ca, you can go and sign up, and we want you to kick the tires and test it out. Just to give you a rare treat, this is the back end of the news sources. And these are the weekly articles that are being hauled in and sorted. And our AI script takes them, does a translation, and summarizes it into 150 words. After that, that's for you to decide whether this article is for interest. And the idea is to keep the leaders of the organizations informed, to give them material that they can use in their newsletters, and generally ensure that these news deserts have at least some sort of information that's pertinent, and not just from CNN or from the New York Times or other kinds of things.
Right. Yeah.
We're going to offer this as a service, at a complimentary service, put a subscription rate on it, because if it's got value, you should pay for it. And I know that's a challenge in this digital age. But so we're looking at everything we can to make the paper viable, but stay within the framework of delivering news and information to the community.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Maybe we can put the website in the chat for people to remind them of where they can go and consult the beta version of that. That's really cool. Thank you for sharing that. I'll go back over to Magda now and ask you, continuing on the topic of the nonprofit model of running a news organization, could you share with us some of the highlights of the work that you've done in this area and how it is or isn't working in some of the places that you've looked at?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And Hugh, I really enjoyed hearing about the Gleaner. I wasn't familiar with that story, and this is what I mean, where I'm a little humbled by, I just think about these ideas, but folks on the ground are actually putting them into practice. My own research on news nonprofits started when I moved to the US in 2009. It was sort of the early days of nonprofit news, which now is pretty big. You've probably heard of ProPublica, or Reveal, or any of the hundreds of news nonprofits that exist in the US. But in 2009, we saw sort of the echoes of the financial crisis that Shannon talked about across American media, and people were getting laid off or leaving their jobs, and starting nonprofit news organizations initially just in small numbers. In 2009, a bunch of those folks got together. There were 25 of them to start what's now called the Institute for Nonprofit News. And it wasn't clear the degree to which this was going to take off, the degree to which it could do, it could provide news on a national, regional, or local level. There were a lot of sort of unknowns at that time. And I think, fast forward 15 years, it has been incredibly successful in the United States. And so there are particular factors in the US that make the nonprofit model work really well, I think. Americans are used to donating to things. You guys, I lived in the US and I had to donate to the public library and to my local school. And, these are things that in Canada we're used to being provided by government, I think. And there's also, a disproportionate number of wealthy foundations and wealthy individuals who can support nonprofit news endeavors and who have. I think the Canadian context is a little different. And Hugh, I hope we can talk afterwards about how you made the nonprofit model work. I think it's proven much more challenging for Canadian communities and Canadian publishers to sort of leverage that. And I should say the US is sort of an exception around the world. There are now, I've sort of lost track, but more than 500 members of the Institute for Nonprofit News. The Canadian government sort of threw open the door to news organizations to adopt nonprofit status a few years ago. And there are 11 official ones, although I note that the Gleaner is not one of them. So I'm curious sort of how many news organizations there are that have nonprofit status through some other legalistic framework. Anyway, sorry to get a little, so in the US, it's been very, very successful. I think in Canada, the context is a little bit different, and we haven't seen sort of the dramatic uptake. So while I think there's a lot to learn from this model in Canada, I'm sort of cautious about it being, I think it's part of the mix, but I'm not sure that it's going to be as big a part of the solution as it has been in the US. But we do have a lot to learn from these news nonprofits. I think where they're at their best, they're collaborating with each other, with mainstream media, and with other community groups as well. One of my students in the US studied a news nonprofit that was collaborating with a choral group, and they were going to sing the results of this big investigation. And so these are all sort of experiments in, as Hugh pointed out, moving beyond just journalism being sort of what you hold in your hand, a newspaper, what you hear on the radio, but rather kind of the space of how can we inform communities better. And so that collaborative aspect, I think, has worked really well because the organizations aren't sort of fighting for readership and for audience in the same way that the commercial news organizations are. And I think that collaboration is a big lesson that we can take as we sort of evolve a new news ecosystem in Canada.
Okay, thank you for that overview. I'd like to also ask you, Magda, about the local journalism initiative. I know that you've looked at that a bit, and there are a lot of community newspapers in Quebec that participate in this program. It is a federally funded program that aims to address the shortage of professional journalists available in some of the smaller remote communities. Could you tell us about some of the strengths and weaknesses that you've seen while looking at that, and that your work has identified?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So where I said sort of the new nonprofit model, I'm not totally sure how big a part of the pie that's going to be in Canada. I think one thing we do have going for us in Canada is a government that really is concerned about what's happening with news and information. And that first slide that you put up, Shannon, was quoting a parliamentary hearing about the state of local news and information. And so seeing the government sort of being concerned and responding through legislation, regardless of what we think of Bill C-18, it was an attempt to try to find a way to fix the relationship between social media and news organizations. So I think, I'm encouraged by the fact that the government is aware of this problem and trying to figure out a way to solve it. So over the last 5 years, through the Local Journalism Initiative, the federal government has spent $70 million on the salaries of journalists at existing news organizations across the country. And as you said, Shannon, it's been extended for the next 3 years, and sort of not clear what happens after that. There's sort of a political element there, and sort of a lot of unknowns. And I think there's so much potential there, and a lot of it is realized over the 5 years. It's paid for the salaries of hundreds of journalists who have written thousands of stories, and those stories are made available publicly for free.
Right, yeah.
And Hugh, I wonder how much the Quebec Connect is sort of relying on stories produced by local journalism initiative reporters. The idea being that because their salaries are paid by government, you can't now put it behind a paywall or own the story. You make it available to anyone else who wants to republish it. And so there's a lot of power there, I think. In some research that I was doing about the local journalism initiative, a student of mine interviewed a reporter at the Eastern Graphic, a tiny newspaper in PEI, and she had written, I think, a 38-part series about homelessness and addiction. I was like, are you sure it's 38 parts? That's a lot of parts. And that series ended up being discussed in the legislature, and actually ended up changing the way that that the government funded services related to homelessness and addiction in PEI. I actually just saw that it was a finalist for the Michener Awards as well, which recognizes
Oh,
journalism.
wow. Oh, great.
So I think that's, there's some of that shows some of the potential of the LJI, but one of the things that my student found was that the Eastern Graphics LJI funding was not renewed. So they had the funding for that journalist for 1 year, and the LJI sort of, Canadian Heritage goes to pains to say it's not it doesn't get automatically renewed. It's a year-by-year sort of process. But one of the challenges I think around the LJI is this lack of transparency and this lack of ability to plan. So the Eastern Graphic hired this amazing reporter. They trained her. She was, I think, pretty young and maybe just out of journalism school. I've forgotten all the details. And they don't know why that position didn't get funded the next year. And so the editor is speculating that it's because they didn't produce the sort of consistent coverage that the LJI requires. So the LJI really is not made for, a slower, more thoughtful reporting. It actually requires news organizations to produce 5 to 7 stories a week. And so the editor says, they contacted us, they asked where were our 5 to 7 stories. We were like, we're working on a huge series, it's going to be big, just wait. And now he speculates that that's the reason that the funding didn't get renewed. It's not clear, but I think that really highlights some of the shortcomings. It's not sort of designed to fund more thoughtful journalism. It's not designed to fund new models or experiments in journalism. It really is to sort of support the churning out of local news in the way that we have in a long time. And it kind of goes back to my thoughts about community-centered journalism. I think part of the reason that we see challenges around news, there are all the financial challenges that you outlined so eloquently, Shannon. But also I think if folks aren't turning to their local news, it's because it's not providing what they need. And so I really believe that people fundamentally do care about what's happening in their local community, but maybe we need to have sort of a re-examining of what it is that folks want and need. And the LJI doesn't really make space for that. And so those are sort of my concerns. And I'm glad it's been renewed. I think it's a really important sort of lifeline for a lot of these publications. But I would love to see it try to do something a little bit different, try to push innovation or diversity or some kind of act as seed money for new projects. There's lots of different sort of possible directions to go here. I should say that it's really hard to be a government funding news. That's been another part of sort of the criticism of the LJI. This is Trudeau's reporters going out and I don't want to engage in that sort of partisan argument, but it is challenging to figure out how to create a program that is going to fund journalism and be able to make the argument, it's at arm's length from politics. So I understand some of those challenges. And so it tries to be very sort of hands-off in terms of, we're not judging on content. We're literally just paying the salaries of folks who are doing whatever it is that they're doing. I see a question about the CBC in the chat, and I know we'll get to a Q&A. That's a very good point. Also challenging, also very contested, right? But I'll leave it there for the moment.
Well, then I'll give you a chance to talk about, if you want to, any of your experiences with the LGI. Do you like to transfer Magda's question about, have you sourced it, do you use it with the Quebec Connect, or have you found it useful for your in your projects?
Well, perhaps more of a general nature. I have absolutely no compunction about exploiting the government for their available resources to support community news services. Greg Duncan put it up that the term community is not just non-profit. It's a model. It's a way of moving forward. There is a number of daily. They were daily. They're now weekly in a cooperative. There's lots of different formulas, and you have to do some planning and some thinking about how it's going to work and how you're going to fund it. Our vision for the Gleaner would be a mix of revenues, approximately 40% advertising, 20% subscriptions, 20% donations, because the Gleaner is recognized as a charitable status as a nonprofit. And I believe young people will donate because it's a good cause rather than subscribe. It's Peter to Paul, but it's how you approach it. And 20% government funding for various different supports, whether it's the Quebec government for operations or whether it's LGI for a reporter. There's a mix of things that you can do there, but I do think that they have a role, just as they contribute to the CBC, to support community newspapers. And the interesting thing between Canada and the United States is that you mentioned the Institute for Nonprofit News. There's Lion, which is the local independent online news. We don't have any organizations really like that. We're a member of Lion. We participate in, because they've got so much information and support for nonprofits. They have a number of Canadian publications that join in with the work that they do. The interesting difference in the US is that they have much different tax structure, and basically every county has somebody who has a foundation that gives away money to good causes, which we don't have in Canada. 40% of nonprofit revenues come from foundations. In the latest survey, they're very dependent on the generosity and it is a community. Whereas in Canada, we have more of a, let's pay some tax, put it into a program. And then, of course, we have the challenge that Maggie just pointed out about the LGA. And so it fits this, model of reporting and journalism. It's not suited to that. And that's always going to be one of the challenges. But yes, we have received the LGI. It's an essential component to maintaining our full-time employment for a journalist. Yes, it's sort of directed towards certain things, but a large part of that fits into our model and what we're doing. So we don't have the same, perhaps, issues that other publications that are trying to do something very different. But this is always a dilemma. One of the projects that we've tried to put forward is that communities on the south shore of Montreal have noticed what we did with the Gleaner. Could we collaborate together in some fashion? And so we've applied for a government program, and the project's been refused because in their interpretation, we're starting a new publication. They don't fund new publications. And we're going, well, we're trying to help the community inform themselves, so it's a different interpretation of what it is that you're trying to do, and that's life in dealing with the government apparatus in general. But as far as I'm concerned, it's an essential component that we need to develop different models, to test new technology. The Quebec Connect is entirely supported by the federal government, and earlier the Secretary of the Development, and I think it's going to be a great service once we get it, completely get the AI under control, all the things that go along with that. But the main purpose is that we're informing the community. And so if it's a paper, we'll do a paper. We've got a website, we've got an app, we've started to do podcasting. We're going to, turn every stone that we can in order to generate the revenue and provide local quality news.
Thank you for that. I think that is a good place for us to transition into question and answer period. We have about 10 minutes left. I do encourage you to use the Q&A box. There are a couple of you who've done so. I do see the chat also kind of active. I'll go there after. I will prioritize the Q&A box though, however. First question we have is from Lorraine O'Donnell from QUESCREN. She asks, do the panelists, so you guys, do you think that newspapers serving official language minority communities should get special funding? And if so, why? Q, I have a feeling you might have an opinion on this.
Absolutely. And I think there are different circumstances across the country. You could talk city, or you could talk rural or regional, or you could talk special, diverse communities and all kinds of things. But as official language minority communities, there's a status within the federal legislation for support. We live in a minority context, so in order to be able to access the level of support, you need to have something additional. And I'm not saying it's got to be this or it's got to be that, but typically the amount of money or I guess the volume of the market that the majority language has gives an advantage, because you're dealing with the majority of people. So that, for example, when the Gleaner goes to a company for advertising, they say, what's your circulation? It's 1,200, and we've got 300 on the newsstands, 1,500 total. And they go, well, I'm not paying too much more, and I get 40,000 from the French language giveaway weekly.
Right.
So it's difficult. So yes, and there's a consortium that's been formed amongst the English and the English minority in Quebec, and the Francophone minority in the rest of the country. They work together, providing some programs for development. There's an internship program and some other kinds of things. And there's no question that without that support, the Gleaner, I don't think, would have made it through. And we've still got a way to go before we get to that formula that I described, the 40, 20, 20, 20, and are able to generate the kinds of revenues that we need for long-term viability.
Right. Magda, did you want to say anything on this topic?
I think I'm happy with Hugh's answer. Thank you.
Okay, sounds good. I will note that in the brief, we talk about a couple of, I list a couple of funding programs that are available to official language minority communities and they're funded through Canadian Heritage. So there are a few things that do a few programs that do single out official language minority community newspapers. Next question in the Q&A is from Dave Cromwell, aka Brian Rock. It looks like he had a bit of trouble logging in, but anyway, his question is, I don't see any reference to news aggregators such as Google News in the presentations. I'm curious if this was considered in your research and metrics, and if so, what was found? Actually, yes. One of the slides when I talk about Google and Meta having taken away a lot of the online revenue, that's what I'm talking about. Their news aggregators, when that online model became more popular, advertisers didn't see a need to go to the online paper to advertise. They could just advertise on Facebook and Google directly. So that is what I'm referring to when I talk about that. And yes, it had a huge impact on the newspaper industry. I'll go into now the chat just to see what folks are chatting about, and give us a couple more minutes here. I'll see if there's any questions. I wonder if
perhaps just a follow-up to that question on the news aggregators. Of course,
sure, yeah, go ahead.
The situation with Meta and Facebook as a result of the C-18 legislation. I mean, it was well intended and is intended to support Canadian media, but the outcome has been, I wouldn't say disastrous, but it's been very difficult because small papers like ourselves can no longer promote the news and information, the headlines, and attract people. And yet at the same time, Google and Meta help themselves to the content and sell it for advertising and make most of the money. So it's a huge challenge. And in particular, going back to the question about minority language, I mean, we're just very, very small fish in a very big pond. And so when they carve up C-18 with Google, maybe I can take the staff out for dinner. I'm not sure. It's not going to save the boat. So there's some significant challenges that we as small publications. The digital revolution at the Google level is meant for millions and millions of views, not for a couple of hundred. And so it continues. The digital conversion or transition is still a significant challenge for small publications in relation to their financial viability.
Right, that's it. Thank you for adding on to that. There is a question that might be interesting for Magda to address briefly. Durhuabi says, I wonder whether the uber polarization of the political landscape in the US has something to do with the success of the nonprofit news model. Do you have anything to say on that for about a minute?
I think that's probably a pretty good analysis. I think the uber polarization of everything in the US contributes to all, affects all aspects of society. I think one thing certainly that we've seen, and this is going way back, like anytime that Congress talks about cutting the appropriation for public radio and public television, the donations that people make sort of makes up for any possible cut in appropriations. So I think there is sort of this sense that nominally public media, which are primarily funded by donors in the U.S., and nonprofit media are sort of political instruments, and a lot of the news nonprofits saw a big spike in donations after the Trump election. So I think that's certainly part of it. I think the sort of larger culture of giving, both on the part of individuals and foundations, is sort of a large part as well. Although what Hugh details about people showing up with checks in hand is amazing, and shows that can happen here as well. And I just wanted to highlight what Hugh said about sort of the fact that there is no Institute for Nonprofit News, there is no local independent online news publishers in Canada. I think that would make a big difference, actually, if there were some kind of an association. In the US, the Institute for Nonprofit News shares best practices. It'll build your website. If you're going to save your local paper and you don't have a web infrastructure, they'll do that for you. But more importantly, I think there's sort of just almost a positive echo chamber of, oh, folks have done this, maybe I can do it too, maybe I can learn from their model. And in the almost 3 years that I've been here, when I talk to folks, that sort of lack of knowledge and lack of, like, I don't have anyone to look to who's already done this. I think it's a big barrier for people, and there are people in Canada who are doing this kind of work, like you. And if there were a way to sort of share that expertise in a more direct way, I think that would help a lot as well.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm gonna have to cut it off here. There are a couple of other mostly comments in the chat. I thank you for participating in that. I'm gonna put my email in the chat here. If anyone has any burning questions that they didn't get answered and you'd like to follow up with us, I can either transfer your email to Hugh or Magda, or I can answer if it applies to my presentation. So I'll go ahead and wrap it up there. Thank you guys so much for attending today's event. We do always want to hear your feedback, and we invite you to fill out the evaluation form for today's Lunch and Learn, which you will find in the link in the chat. While today is our final Lunch and Learn for the season, we do have some other activities planned later this spring that you can learn about on the events page of the QUESCREN website. Additionally, we'd like to share with you that there's an upcoming event from our partners at the School of Community and Public Affairs, which is a panel discussion on language policy that will be held on March 26th in person at the John Molson School of Business. And my colleague will also share that link in the chat. The best way to learn about what's coming up in our programming is to sign up for our newsletter if you haven't already, or to follow us on Facebook or LinkedIn. And those links should be showing up in the chat here in a second as well. In closing, we recognize the financial support of the Secrétariat aux relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise and our other funders, Canadian Heritage, the Canadian Institute for Research on Linguistic Minorities, and Concordia University. Thank you to my colleague Anna Hunt today for her technical support, and as well a huge thank you to Magda and Hugh for their participation in our panel, and for all of you attending, and we wish you a great day. See you next time. And that is 1 o'clock. We hit it on the dot.